70 miles an hour in the hammer lane going into hallway.
This case wasn't just a pursuit on Interstate 270. It was the collision between a man who believed he had no way out and a system trained to prevent public harm. Long before the first patrol unit made contact, the decision-making had already started. Not just from law enforcement, but from him. When someone says, "There's no way out of this," that isn't frustration. That's psychological narrowing. That's a mindset where options disappear and confrontation feels inevitable. What makes this case different is not how it ended. It's how many times officers tried to slow it down. Disengagement orders, air support tracking, distance instead of pressure. And yet, despite restraint, the situation still escalated. We're not replaying footage for drama. We're breaking down the thresholds, psychological, tactical, and legal, that turned a developing situation into a point of no return. Because the most important moment in this case happened before most people even realized it had begun. It's the moment where the system tried to prevent it and failed. To understand what happened on Interstate 270, you have to rewind before the highway. This started with an active felony warrant. Law enforcement wasn't looking for a traffic violation. They were looking for a man already tied to a serious domestic incident. There was a protection order in place. Tensions had been building. This wasn't random. At the same time, something else was happening behind the scenes. His girlfriend was in contact with authorities. And during that conversation, she said something that should immediately shift how we frame this case. She told dispatch he felt trapped, that he believed there was no way out, and that he had talked about wanting to go out blazing. Pause on that for a second. When someone expresses that kind of thinking, it changes the risk profile instantly. Not because it guarantees what they will do, but because it signals cognitive narrowing. When people begin to believe their future only contains consequences, arrest, exposure, loss, their brain stops searching for long-term solutions. It shifts into short-term survival framing. And in that state, confrontation can feel like control. Now, layer that onto the law enforcement side. Supervisors were aware of the warrant. They were aware of the domestic background. And soon, they became aware that he was mobile, moving, driving. That changes everything. A stationary subject can be contained. A moving one creates variables. Traffic, civilians, speed, unpredictability. But here's where this case already separates itself from the average pursuit narrative. Radio traffic indicates supervisors quickly moved toward controlled tracking. Air support took priority. Ground units were instructed not to aggressively engage. At one point, officers were explicitly told not to initiate a full cruiser pursuit. That matters, because it tells you the strategy from the start was not pressure. It was containment. Distance instead of escalation. Eyes from above instead of bumpers behind. And that decision reflects something important about modern pursuit policy in the United States. Departments today operate under heavy scrutiny. Civil liability, public risk analysis. Supervisors are trained to weigh the danger of a suspect fleeing against the danger of officers pushing too hard. So from the very beginning, this was a balancing act. On one side, a man who may already believe the outcome is inevitable. On the other, a system trying to slow the clock. And for a brief window, it almost worked. Helicopter tracking creates space. It reduces the psychological intensity that a suspect feels when lights are directly behind them. Many pursuits end safely because pressure decreases. But that only works if the person still values a future beyond the moment. That's the variable no policy can fully control. And that's where this case begins to tighten. For a period of time, this situation was being managed. Air support maintained visual contact. Ground units kept distance. Supervisors were making real-time calculations about speed, traffic density, and location. That's controlled monitoring. But controlled monitoring depends on one critical assumption, that the subject's movement remains directional and predictable. That assumption broke. At some point during the drive, the vehicle entered opposing lanes of travel on Interstate 270. Not drifting, not momentarily crossing. Sustained wrong-way travel. That is the moment this stops being about evasion and starts becoming about public exposure. There's a legal distinction here that most casual viewers miss. Fleeing from law enforcement is one category of offense. It's serious, but it's still primarily about avoiding arrest. Driving directly into oncoming traffic changes the framework. It introduces immediate third-party risk. Now the question is no longer, how do we catch him? It becomes, how do we prevent innocent motorists from being pulled into this? And that shift compresses time. When a vehicle moves against traffic flow at speed, every approaching driver has seconds, sometimes less, to react. Officers observing from the air can see the pattern developing before the public fully registers it. They hear the radio updates. They see brake lights ahead. They see swerving corrections. That overhead perspective changes the urgency. This is where policy and reality intersect. Earlier, disengagement made sense. Distance reduced pressure. But wrong-way travel removes the buffer. You can't create space when the path itself is endangering others. Containment from above no longer neutralizes the threat footprint below. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Once a subject's actions create immediate risk to uninvolved civilians, law enforcement authority expands. Not emotionally, not punitively, but legally. Under constitutional standards, force decisions are evaluated based on objective reasonableness, what a trained officer would perceive in that moment, not what hindsight reveals later. When the threat extends beyond officers and begins to endanger the public, the calculus changes. This is the threshold moment, not the collision, not the final confrontation. This, the moment supervisors realize the behavior has crossed from flight into active danger. The moment officers on the ground understand that simply watching from above may not prevent impact. The moment reaction time narrows to seconds. And here's what makes this case even more complex. From a behavioral standpoint, wrong-way driving is rarely accidental in these contexts. It signals desperation. It signals disregard for self-preservation. It signals that the internal narrative, there's no way out, may have fully taken hold. When someone stops protecting their own safety, predicting their next move becomes exponentially harder. That's what officers were facing. A moving vehicle, reduced predictability, civilian traffic, diminishing options. And once those elements align, the system shifts from patience to prevention. What happens next is not chaos. It's compression. Time compresses. Options compress. Outcomes compress. And when that compression reaches its limit, events unfold quickly. When people watch the final moments of an incident like this, they often slow it down. They replay it frame by frame. They pause. They zoom in. They analyze body positioning, spacing, angles. But that's not how it unfolded in real time. In real time, everything accelerated. As the vehicle's movement destabilized traffic flow, the margin for passive monitoring disappeared. What had been a moving situation became a fixed point. Once a vehicle stops abruptly after sustained high-risk driving, uncertainty spikes. Is the driver incapacitated? Is he surrendering? Is he attempting to reposition? No one knows yet. And in those seconds, officers have to move. This is where tactical reality collides with public expectation. Viewers see video with context. Officers experience fragments, sound, motion, partial visibility, radio chatter overlapping, adrenaline rising. When the human body enters acute stress mode, perception narrows. Auditory exclusion can occur. Time can feel distorted, either slowed down or hyper-accelerated. That's not dramatic language, and that's physiology. Heart rate increases. Fine motor skills degrade. Decision-making shifts from analytical to trained response patterns. This is why repetition and policy matter so much. Because in compressed time, officers do not invent new strategies. They rely on what has been drilled. Now layer in one more factor. Earlier in the event, there were statements indicating the driver felt there was no way out. When officers approach a stopped vehicle under those conditions, they are not just evaluating compliance. They're evaluating unpredictability. A person who has abandoned long-term thinking can act in ways that defy normal negotiation cues. That uncertainty shapes posture, distance, positioning. And here's what most breakdowns never explain. Officers are not deciding whether they want escalation. They're deciding whether the risk in front of them has crossed into immediate threat territory. That distinction matters. The standard is not perfection. It is objective reasonableness in a rapidly evolving situation. From the outside, it can look sudden. From inside the moment, it feels like a narrowing funnel. Each second removes an option. Verbal commands may be issued. Movement is assessed. Hands are tracked. Body language is read in fractions of a second. And then the threshold is reached. Not because of anger. Not because of adrenaline alone. But because the totality of behavior leading up to that point, the warrant, the flight, the wrong way driving, the unpredictability, compresses into a single evaluation. Is there an immediate threat that must be stopped? Once that evaluation resolves, action follows. Afterward, the scene slows again. Adrenaline begins to taper. Reality re-enters. Officers check on one another. They call for medical response. They begin preserving the scene. The same system that compressed now expands into procedure. And this is the part viewers rarely sit with. Not the split-second action, but the seconds after. The silence, the wait, the recognition that no one arrives at this point casually. It is the end point of accumulated decisions. The collision point wasn't just physical, it was psychological, tactical, legal. And once crossed, it can't be undone. Now we need to slow this down and separate emotion, because when an incident reaches this point, the legal question is not, was the outcome tragic? Tragedy and legality are not the same category. The legal question is much narrower. At the moment force was used, would a reasonable officer, standing in those same circumstances, believe there was an immediate threat to others? That standard comes from Supreme Court precedent. It's called objective reasonableness, and it requires evaluating the situation from the perspective of the officer on scene, not from hindsight, not from slow-motion replay, and not from information learned. So what factors matter? Severity of the underlying offense. Act, immediate threat to officers, or the P in this case. The underlying offense was not minor. There was a felony warrant tied to a domestic situation with an existing protection order. That established second. There was act third, and most critical. There was behavior that expanded risk to uninvolved motorists. Sustained wrong-way travel transforms the legal landscape. At that point, the potential victims are no longer just officers at TEM, and that changes everything. Under constitutional analysis, once a suspect's actions create an imminent risk of serious harm to others, law enforcement is not required to wait for impact. They are not required to absorb the danger and hope it resolves. The law permits intervention when the threat is immediate and ongoing. This is where many public debates become emotionally charged. People ask, was there another option? And that's a fair question. But legally, the standard is not whether an alternative existed in theory. It's whether the chosen action was reasonable, given the totality of circumstances in real time. Remember the earlier decisions. Supervisors disengaged ground pursuit. They relied on air support. They reduced pressure when possible. That pattern matters in legal review because it demonstrates restraint before escalation. Grand juries don't evaluate cases based on internet commentary. They review radio logs, policy manuals, timeline reconstruction, use of force reports, medical findings, video from multiple angles. They examine whether the sequence shows recklessness or measured response to evolving risk. And in this case, the legal conclusion was that the threshold had shifted, that once the suspect's behavior created immediate public danger, officers were operating within constitutional boundaries. That doesn't make the outcome emotionally easy. It doesn't make it satisfying. But legality is about standards, not feelings. And this is important for viewers to understand. Constitutional policing is built around split-second judgment under uncertainty. Officers are not granted unlimited authority, but they are granted discretion when immediate threat conditions are met. That discretion is later scrutinized under the lens of objective reasonableness. If you remove the wrong-way travel from this case, the analysis looks different. If you remove the sustained flight, it looks different. If you remove the felony warrant context, it looks different. But law doesn't analyze events in isolation. It analyzes the totality. And the totality here shows a progression from attempted containment to escalating public risk to compressed decision-making under constitutional authority. That is why the legal threshold shifted, not at the beginning, not during monitoring, but at the moment risk expanded beyond the individual and into the public sphere. When the movement stops, when the radio traffic quiets, when supervisors begin scene protocol, something else begins. Adrenaline fades, and clarity sets in. In incidents like this, the public often fixates on legality. Was it justified? Was it within policy? Did it meet the constitutional standard? Those are necessary questions. But they are not the only ones that matter. Because even when force is legally justified, it still carries weight. You can hear it in post-incident audio, the shift in tone, the breathing, the statements that aren't tactical anymore. They're human. There's a phrase sometimes heard after events like this. We should have ended it earlier. That sentence isn't about blame. It isn't a confession. It's hindsight speaking into a moment that felt uncontrollable. It's the mind replaying options that may not have truly existed in real time. That's called moral compression. When someone is forced to make a decision under extreme pressure, and afterward, their brain searches for alternative paths, even if those paths were never realistically available. Officers are trained to act decisively when a threat threshold is crossed. What they are not trained to do is feel nothing afterward. And despite public perception, most don't. There's also the other side, a family that now lives with an outcome that cannot be reversed, a relationship that deteriorated to the point of protection orders, a series of decisions that narrowed over time until one final day brought everything into focus. This is the part that rarely fits into headlines. The event may have unfolded in minutes, but the buildup took months, maybe years. Legal pressure, personal breakdown, escalating conflict, cognitive narrowing, each step tightening the circle. By the time officers encountered him that day, they were not witnessing the beginning of a crisis. They were encountering the final chapter of one. And that matters, because it reframes the narrative from one dramatic incident to a system intersecting with an already deteriorating situation. Law enforcement stepped into a trajectory that was already in motion. They attempted to slow it. At points, they disengaged. They contained. They monitored. But once behavior expanded into immediate public risk, intervention became inevitable. Afterward, the paperwork begins. Reports, reviews, administrative leave, internal investigation, external review, grand jury presentation. These processes are not symbolic. They are structured precisely because society recognizes how serious these moments are. But procedures don't erase impact. For officers, incidents like this can linger, not because they doubt legality, but because they replay humanity. The what-ifs, the alternate timelines, the earlier intervention that might have prevented escalation months before. And that's the uncomfortable truth. By the time law enforcement becomes involved at this level, prevention has already failed somewhere else. Community systems, domestic support, mental health stabilization, personal accountability. Somewhere upstream, warning signs existed. What unfolded on that highway was the visible collision, but the invisible breakdown happened long before, and that's where the real conversation should shift. If you strip away the headlines, the flashing lights, and the emotional reactions, what this case ultimately comes down to is thresholds. Not one explosive moment, a series of thresholds. A psychological threshold, the point at which a person begins to believe there are no viable options left, when language shifts from problem-solving to fatalism. There's no way out. That phrase doesn't just describe emotion. It narrows perception. It compresses decision-making. It removes long-term thinking and replaces it with immediate impulse. That kind of cognitive narrowing changes behavior long before officers ever make contact. Then there's the tactical threshold. Law enforcement did not immediately rush into confrontation. Air support was used. Distance was maintained. Supervisors authorized disengagement at earlier points. That is not aggression. That's controlled monitoring. That's what measured response looks like in the field. But controlled response has limits. When behavior transitions from self-risk to exposing uninvolved motorists to immediate danger, the threshold shifts. Not emotionally, not politically, legally. And that leads to the constitutional threshold. The legal standard is not perfection. It is not hindsight. It is not whether the situation could have unfolded differently in an ideal world. The standard is objective reasonableness. Would a reasonable officer, given the totality of circumstances at that exact moment, perceive an immediate threat requiring decisive intervention? Remove the sustained flight, and the analysis changes. Remove the wrong way travel, and it changes again. Remove the broader felony context, and it changes again. But the law does not remove facts to make the situation easier to judge. It evaluates the full picture as it existed in real time. That's what internal review examines. That's what prosecutors examine. That's what courts examine. And here is the part that often gets overlooked. By the time this situation reached the highway, the deeper deterioration had already occurred upstream. The protection order, the domestic instability, the psychological narrowing, the belief that there was no viable alternative path forward. Law enforcement did not create that deterioration. They encountered it at its most volatile stage. Prevention rarely fails in one dramatic moment. It fails quietly, in stages, until one incident makes it visible. What we witnessed here was not simply enforcement, it was intersection. An individual who had run out of perceived options, a system attempting structured containment, a public safety threshold crossed, and a compressed decision made under constitutional authority. It is easy to debate outcomes from a distance. It is far more difficult to sit with the complexity of how those outcomes develop. If there is a lesson here, it is not about spectacle. It is about recognizing early warning signs, taking domestic volatility seriously, understanding how quickly cognitive narrowing reshapes decision-making, and acknowledging that when immediate public safety is at risk, the window for ideal solutions becomes very small. Not one isolated bad decision, but a narrowing path, on both sides, until the available options simply ran out. And that is what this case ultimately reflects. If you've made it this far, you already understand something most surface-level commentary misses. These cases are rarely about a single moment. They're about patterns, thresholds, decision-making under compression. And if we're going to have serious conversations about law enforcement, public safety, and accountability, we have to move beyond emotional reaction and into structured analysis. Because policy matters, psychology matters, constitutional standards matter, and nuance matters. On this channel, we don't just replay footage. We slow it down. We examine the behavioral indicators. We look at tactical positioning. We break down the legal framework that governs split-second decisions. Not to inflame, not to defend blindly, and not to condemn reflexively, but to understand. If you value that kind of breakdown, the psychology, the policy, and the constitutional side of real-world encounters, make sure you're subscribed. Because the next case might look different on the surface, but the underlying thresholds, they're often the same. I'll see you in the next analysis.